Today's episode of the Counselling Tutor Podcast is sponsored by Web Healer. You're a counsellor in private practice and you need a website, or you've got an existing website which you need help with. Web Healer are offering Counselling Tutor Podcast listeners, that's you, £100 off the cost of a website design and build. Now, Web Healers specialize in websites for counselors and psychotherapists. It's what they do. And the Web Healer team provide a completely non-technical, done-for-you solution, leaving you to focus your time on your clients. Operating for 20 years, Web Healer are a trusted resource amongst counselors when it comes to getting your practice online. So get the package details and claim your £100 off coupon for your new website by going to counsellingtutor.com/website. That's counsellingtutor.com/website.
Hi, I'm Rory and welcome to episode 318 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Our guest today is Caz Binstead, a respected psychotherapist known for her pioneering work in relational ethics. Caz's approach champions compassion, solidarity and justice in therapy, encouraging therapists to foster authentic, socially conscious relationships with clients and colleagues alike. She's joining us to discuss her upcoming book, Relational Ethics in Psychotherapy and Counselling Private Practice, which offers invaluable insights for practitioners looking to deepen their ethical practice. So with that said, it's over to you, Ken.
Welcome to the Counselling Tutor Podcast, the must-listen-to podcast for counsellors, psychotherapists, and counselling students. Here are your hosts, Rory Oakes and Ken Kelly.
A very warm welcome from myself, Ken Kelly, and of course from Rory Oakes to the Counselling Tutor Podcast, and it is episode 318 that you're joining us on. And today, 3 topics. First, we start off with that ethical, sustainable practice where we're speaking about autism and the law. So this continues our discussion on looking at neurodivergence and how we might work within our practice to be inclusive. We then go on to practice matters, and as Rory has beautifully introduced, we're speaking with Rory was speaking with Caz Binstead, and that's talking about her book, Relational Ethics in Psychotherapy and Counselling Private Practice. So that's going to be an interesting one for all. And then we go into our student services, recognizing you, our students, on your formal journey. And today we're going to be speaking about, can you claim expenses as a placement counsellor? Oh, that'll be an interesting chat. But let's start ourselves off, Rory. Let's look at that ethical, sustainable practice where we want our practice to be ethical. We want to have sustainability. And I guess when we're speaking about neurodivergence, it keys into both of those areas, because we've got the ethical side where we need to look to be inclusive of all that come to our practice, and then of course sustainability, as we've spoken, there is a great opportunity in kind of doing training, I guess, to work with a neurodivergent client, because it kind of may broaden our client base, which adds sustainability to our practice. It's a rising tide, as they say, in terms of neurodivergent individuals being more recognized. And we need to, I think, look at what the law says about this, Rory.
Yeah, absolutely, Ken. And I think a good place to start really is first principles. The first place we go when we're thinking about our practice is the ethical framework. Most ethical frameworks, depending on which professional body that you're a member of, always say you have to obey the law. That's written into ethics. And in the law we're talking about in this case, well, there's actually 2 laws, is the Equality Act of 2010 and the Autism Act of 2009. And I think it's really, really important that we understand that if we're to be inclusive therapists, and we put our adverts on pages or directories or wherever we advertise, that we're advertising to the general public. The general public are going to read that. And the general public are made up of many people, including those who are autistic or on the neurodivergent parts of society. So it's really important that when we have our offering, that we make sure that we can accommodate something called reasonable adjustments. And what reasonable adjustments are is that we adjust for people who come to our practice. So a very simple one, which I think everybody can visualize, is, does your practice have wheelchair access? And a lot of practices now are, on the ground floor or in buildings where people can access using a wheelchair. Wheelchair users is the correct term. But actually, I think neurodivergence and autism is something that perhaps goes under the radar a bit, Ken. And I think, part of what we're doing is to raise awareness and to start that conversation about, what are reasonable adjustments for people who are either neurodivergent or autistic.
100%. And as you said, Rory, we're called upon by the law to consider those reasonable adjustments. So, you mentioned two acts, and we're speaking obviously from the United Kingdom, so we can only refer to the law here in the United Kingdom. Please, if you're outside of the United Kingdom, have a look at what the legislation is that applies to you and your practice. So the Equality Act of 2010, I think, would be pretty well known to our listeners. If you're listening to this, if you've studied counselling or you're out and you are working as a counsellor, that is an act that that you're probably going to, well, I would hope that you would be familiar with. Because you're going to be working to that law. But what is maybe not as well known is the Autism Act of 2009. And it's interesting that it predates the Equalities Act of 2010, the Autism Act. And I'd like to just kind of read a bit of a précis of what this is. There's the Autism Act 2009 is a pioneering law, the first disability-specific legislation in the UK. It mandates the government to implement and update the adult autism strategy, focusing on improving services for autistic clients. While it primarily targets broader social services, its ethos of protective support aligns with therapeutic practice, where you must continually review and adapt to the needs of the neurodivergent client. So there it is. That is a law. That is in place in the United Kingdom. You can go and look that up. If you just go onto Google and put in Autism Act 2009, you'll be able to download that and have a look at the entirety of that legislation. But the big takeaway there, Rory, is that that we are called upon to continually that's a difficult word, continually review and adapt to the needs of the neurodivergent client. And that's what you're speaking about, Rory, when you say reasonable adjustments. And of course, we're talking here about our anticipatory duty as therapists, Rory.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely right, Ken. And just to roll back just a little before we speak about anticipatory duties, there is another law called the Children and Families Act of 2014, and this act is for children and young people, and that is going to speak directly to those practitioners who are listening who may be working in schools or colleges or, schools, primarily I think schools and colleges. And I think it's really useful to be aware of that act, because some children who are autistic may have health and care plans, education, health and care plans, and part of that the counsellor may be involved with. But to move on to anticipatory duty, I think it's an interesting one. I think the clue very much is in the phraseology. Anticipate what clients may need. And I think that when we're looking at anticipatory duty, what that really means is how are we flexible in our practice to support any area where people may be disabled. And I use that word kind of thoughtfully. But anticipatory duty is, well, how are you going to adapt your practice for specific clients? And if we're talking about neurodivergent and autistic clients, there are a few things that we know. And a very simple one, I know you've spoken about this so often, is, if you've got a clock in your room, most therapists have a clock in the room. does it tick? Is it one of those ones that goes tick, 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 or is it one of those that is kind of silent? And if it's a ticking clock, that might be very, very distracting to someone who's autistic, because some autistic people hear background sounds as loud as they hear someone speaking to them. They can't switch off the background sounds. So part of it, I think, is to, I think if I hope that anybody does a takeaway from this part of the podcast, is they start to do a bit of an audit about their practice rooms. Is your practice room neurodivergent friendly? What happens if you have a client who says, well, look, I really don't like bright lights. Can you turn your lights off? Have you got any facility for turning your lights off? Or what about a client who says, I get really distracted. Have you got any fidget toys or anything that people can play with? And what about just a very simple one? A client says, I can only do half an hour today because I'm having a really bad day. My energy levels are depleted and I can only do half an hour. Are you okay with that? And I think it's about really, obviously the CPD around this is essential, but it's also about really making sure that we kind of form and shape our practice where we can for those who are neurodivergent. Just as we would if someone was a wheelchair user, we wouldn't have any problem with saying someone was a wheelchair user. We'd try our very best to accommodate them. Then we must try our best for all areas of equality, and autism is one of those. And to be quite frank, it's a growing area.
Yeah, very much so. Beautifully said there, Rory. And we're going to naturally touch on areas and kind of suggestions that we have mentioned before. Why? Because they fall into this legislation. They fall into what we're talking about. So it's not us just repeating it. It's because it's relevant to what we're saying here. And you mentioned when you went into this anticipatory that it's that word there is anticipating what somebody's needs are, and we're called upon to think about this. And the first step of anticipating needs is to have an understanding of that person and of that sector. So if we're speaking about neurodivergence, it starts with CPD. You mentioned how important CPD is. We cannot anticipate that we don't know. You don't know what you don't know. So it is out of awareness. It's not there at all. So by doing the correct CPD, by doing the correct training, it gives us an indication of how a neurodivergent person may present, or the challenges that they may face. And then with that information, and of course in consultation with that client, we may then anticipate what needs that person may have. And you spoke about a number of the different factors that we would cover in this. So the domains that we map to are environmental modifications. Like you said, Rory, it might be sound, it might be light, it might be temperature. What is it within our environment that we can adjust to make that person feel more comfortable? And how do we find out what it is that they need to be able to make that adjustment? Session flexibility, counsellor, it's obviously an hour-long session or a 50-minute session with 5 minutes hello and 5 minutes goodbye. Why? Well, because that's what I learned at college. Well, if we're talking about reasonable adjustments, we're talking about that anticipatory duty of therapists, then maybe we need to look, can we be flexible in our sessions? Can we be that? And then, of course, clear communication. Counselling and psychotherapy is about communication. It's about a client coming in, bringing where they're at and how life is for them and what they might be carrying. And without any communication, we're not going to go anywhere. So we need clear communication. And if we look at neurodivergence, it tends to be a communication challenge. There are challenges there. People might need to hear things differently. You might need to maybe draw things. You might need to have diagrams. So you would, again, need to anticipate what could I do to improve the communication for this specific person? And then, of course, supporting regulation. So regulation within neurodivergence, you've mentioned, Rory, maybe a fidget spinner or something like that. There may be the person would like to stim. And STIM is short for stimulate. It's self-stimulation. It is a way of self-soothing and self-calming for that individual within a moment. And I know that I myself, as a proudly neurodivergent person, I STIM. I have things that I do that will restore my points and make me feel better and energize me if I'm in a difficult situation. I can share without breaking any confidentiality that my wife is neurodivergent. She's just been away to a conference where she was stimming continuously, really, and it was kind of she had a little fidget spinner that she was spinning the whole time that she was there, proudly and happily and openly and with acceptance. But can you imagine a client coming in and maybe having a little spinny toy that they've got on our table within our therapy room, and they start spinning it, and the therapist not understanding that, saying, "Oh, I'd rather you put that away so that we can concentrate on the therapy." Just think how that would be for that individual, that they're doing to self-regulate. Can we support that regulation? What does it mean? Well, it means understanding what stimming is and what that may look like. It means obviously having that open communication and discussing it with the client and making allowances, the reasonable adjustments that we can make within our practice. So, implications for practice, Rory, as we go into what is my anticipatory duty, what CPD might I do, how do I approach the conversation about adjustments with clients? Let's go into that section, and I'm of course reading from the super duper handout that we're going to share with you in a moment of where to get that.
Yes, and anticipatory duty. Well, I mean, I think the thing is that as Ken said, you don't know what you don't know. So I think that the handout's going to be really, really, really helpful. But this anticipatory duty, I think, speaks to reflection and reflexivity. Reflection is what all therapists should do. We should all sit down, maybe with a pen and a paper and a cup of tea, and just have a think about the shape of our practice and what it looks like from the outside, from the client's frame of reference, because everything we do is from the client's frame of reference, and that includes any advertising or marketing we do. So have a think about that. How are you going to communicate to autistic or neurodivergent clients that you are neurodivergent or autistic friendly? How are you going to give clients confidence to call you where maybe in the past they've had real difficulty with therapists because they really didn't understand the neurodivergent world? So I think that's a real good starting point. And some of the things you might want to think about is CPD. We don't know what we don't know. And by doing continual professional development, by doing a course, you will understand and begin to appreciate the struggle that neurodivergent clients may have when accessing therapy. And there was a great quote that I read the other day, and I can't attribute it to someone because I can't remember who said it, but they said, "I can't afford to have therapy, but I can't afford not to have therapy." And from a neurodivergent lens, that is, I've had so many difficult engagements in therapy. I don't want to put myself in there again. And on the other hand, I really need the help. So I think all therapists really need to think about the shape of the practice and look at ongoing CPD, and also about how do you approach the conversation about adjustments with clients. And I think here it might be useful to think about where you meet the client. The first time you meet a client probably isn't face-to-face. It's probably through your directory listings or your website or your social media if you promote yourself on social media. That conversation should really start there, explaining about how your neurodivergence affirming, how you work with neurodivergent people, how you're happy to talk about reasonable adjustments, and of course that speaks really to contracting. So when you're putting your offer together, show the potential client that you will help them, that you will be there for them, and that you will make those reasonable adjustments. And I think finally, ongoing collaboration with colleagues and supervisors. Having a supervisor that is neurodivergent informed or autistically informed is going to be so helpful. We've talked on the podcast about trauma-informed practice, and we've said supervisors should be trauma-informed. Supervisors should have a working knowledge of working with autistic clients, because you're asking them for professional consultation, and if they haven't got that area, they should either get skilled up on it or they should refer you on. And discussion with colleagues, it should be an ongoing conversation. And then I think tools and approaches. How do we modify the therapy room? How do you modify the environment? And I think by having those conversations, you're going to get a very rich seam of information speaking to how you can adapt not only what the client's experience is in the therapy room, but also your approach and how you communicate what your practice looks like to a autistic or neurodivergent client.
Yeah, there's lots in there, isn't there?
There is.
And what's interesting, all of this just keys into the legislation. The legislation is asking us to look at this. And of course, there's no secret that Rory, myself, and our academic team have built a working therapeutically with autism or autistic clients course. If you want to find out more about that, just go to counsellingtutor.com. And what we've done is we've really woven in certainly the topics that we've discussed today. And part of the course is self-directed learning, where you get the information, but there's also a live implementation workshop where you come together as a community and you get added to a community of peers. So it gives you that community where you can have these discussions. After the course is finished, you retain access to that community and to all the information, so you can go back and re-look at that whenever you need. But everything we're speaking about, including the handout that I'm going to share with you, is taken from our course. So if you're interested in that, counsellingtutor.com, just click on our services and products and you'll find it right there, and you can join the wait list for the next intake on that one. But if you want to get the Autism and the Law, a guide for counsellors and psychotherapists handout, it's one of Rory's super duper handouts. You can get it for free. And how do you get that? Well, you just need to go to our mother website, which is counsellingtutor.com. Make sure that you click on the podcast tab, and then make your way to episode 318. That's 318. Right there on that page is a link to a really in-depth article on this topic. And on that page, you'll be able to download the super duper handout, which covers the following learning outcomes. You can identify the key legislations that protect autistic individuals, understand therapists' responsibilities under the Equality Act of 2010 and the Autism Act of 2009, and evaluate what reasonable adjustments mean to you in your practice, and then develop strategies to accommodate autistic clients' needs proactively within your practice. So that is available for you. Don't forget to get that super duper handout. Any last thoughts as we back out of our ethical, sustainable practice today, Rory?
Yeah, I have a final thought. I have all our family are neurodivergent, and one of the things that brought me to be a therapist was supporting a loved one many years ago who was going through a very difficult time, who was subsequently has a diagnosis of autism, and that person had a lot of therapy, and most of it was all right, but it wasn't that effective. It was only when that person, that loved one, actually met a neurodivergence aware therapist that actually things started to change, and part of that was the person going on to get a diagnosis. And it just takes one person in someone's life. It just takes one person who's aware, who can support and is knowledgeable and can offer an environment where that part of that person can be explored that can change a life. It's so important. We do it all the time for clients, and we really do need to do it for autistic and neurodivergent clients.
Yeah, I love that you ended with that, Rory, because it kind of shows a difference being made. And at Counselling Tutor, we've got an entire library of continuing professional development lectures for counsellors and psychotherapists. And the sole reason that they're there for only one reason. It's not so we can tick off our tracker and say we've done our hours for the year of CPD. We do CPD for deeper, more meaningful relationships with our clients, so that there are the outcomes that you've just alluded to there, Rory. When we're able to go there with the client, it makes such a difference. That is our ethical, sustainable practice for today. We now move into Practice Matters. This is the CPD section of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. So you can mark it down on your CPD tracker. Make sure you claim the time for listening to Caz Binstead. And she's going to be speaking with you, Rory. You held this interview online, and it's about a book that she's just put out, and that's Relational Ethics in Psychotherapy and Counselling in Private Practice.
Yeah, Caz Binstead is a well-known, well-respected, and I'm going to say much-loved member of the counselling community. She's done so much for bringing practice and relational ethics and join the counselling community together. So I'm absolutely delighted to be interviewing her today about a new book, Relational Ethics in Psychotherapy and Counselling Private Practice. She talks about why she wrote the book and the sentiments behind it. And this is what she had to say.
Practice Matters is proudly sponsored by the Counsellor CPD Library. To access top quality, relevant continuing professional development for your practice that you can do at a time that suits you, and all for less than the price of a cup of coffee, visit counsellingtutor.com.
Today, my guest is an experienced therapist, supervisor, and lead author of Relational Ethics in Psychotherapy and Counselling Private Practice, Solidarity, Compassion, Justice, which Routledge will publish on November the 26th, 2024. The book is part of the esteemed Ethics in Action series. It's edited by Professor Lynn Gabriel and Professor Andrew Reeves, and this book has already garnered high praise from influential figures in our field, such as Dr. Dwight Turner, Janine Connor, Susan Utting-Simon, and Dr. Mish Seabrook. So it's my great pleasure to welcome Caz Binstead. Caz, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, really good to be here, Rory. I'm a big fan of Counselling Tutor, and obviously we've spoken before, so it's great to be back.
Yeah, we had a bit of a natter before we actually hit the record button, and we both decided it was a bit too long since we've seen each other. I think we caught up and time has passed, and I think my introduction really doesn't do you justice. I read in your bio that you've got over 10,000 hours of counselling with clients, and also you are very well published. Papers, consultation. I mean, the list is long and distinguished, Caz.
Thank you, Rory. You're too kind. But I've done a lot of work, particularly in the area of private practice over the years. And I've really, really enjoyed it. And I suppose I'm really excited for this book to be out, because it's a continuation, but also I guess further exploration, a deeper look at some of the things that have been really important for me.
Yes. I guess that brings me on to my first question. What inspired you to write a book on relation ethics? That's the first question. Mm-hmm. And why do you believe this topic is relevant for therapists in private practice today? Yeah,
so our last conversation was obviously a BACP special with the then head of ethics, Joe Langston. And the reason why I got involved with the BACP back in 2018, and I joined their private practice division, was because I felt really, really strongly that private practitioners didn't get enough support. it is a very niche sector. And there's a very high number of people working in private practice. I'm sure it's probably not controversial to say that jobs are maybe not as forthcoming as we might wish them to be. So that means around, I think the statistic that I've put in the book is, which comes from the BACP's own figures, is it's just under 70% who work in private practice. Now, as you will know, Rory, a lot of those people have actually come straight out of training. They're people who, quite rightly, want to use the skills that they've earned, that they've learned, and do the job that they have been trained to do. But it does mean that they're going straight into private practice, and they may not really know how to do that. And one of the things that I have felt very strongly about was that because a lot of trainings don't cover this. Now, some do. Some will do a very small amount, but across the board, it's not very well covered on trainings. And so I felt quite passionately about the largest membership body actually supplying some information on that, which is what led to the private practice toolkit. But which I was divisional lead on that toolkit. But I guess at the heart of that work was about how we need to balance basically ethics and keep always in our minds as private practitioners the therapeutic side of things, and keep on tuning into our ethical practice with setting up a business and all kinds of things like, the fact that if we're working full time in private practice, for example, it may be our only income. So stuff like money coming into it. So there are a lot of ethical considerations in private practice that are very, very specific to private practice, actually. And so, I am an integrative therapist. I believe very much that the relationship is at the heart of the work. So not just ethics, but relational ethics. The book's given a chance for a real look at this using kind of case studies, our own model, which will help people hopefully reflect on things. Basically an answer to your question, because it's everything that I love in terms of thinking about how to build I'll use the word successful, but by that I kind of mean a sustainable private practice.
Yes, ethical, sustainable practice is the byword and the clarion call at Counselling Tutor. And,
right,
ethical and sustainable practice. Now, in the book, you emphasise the principles of solidarity, compassion, and justice. That's actually in the title. Could you elaborate a little bit on how these values kind of integrate within the therapeutic relationship and private practice in general?
Yeah. So the words have kind of meanings on different levels. So one thing that we've tried to do with the book is to be very, very realistic about how private practice is. Okay, so not how it should be, not how we should think about things as private practitioners, but how it is on all levels. And so we of course, as we always have to, we're thinking about the clients first. We're thinking about, how do we best serve them? How do we not harm clients? All kinds of, crucial things like that. But we're also bringing into consideration things that can have an effect on what's going on in the work, how we might set up our private practices, what may happen in relational dynamics, and that kind of will be what the clients are bringing into the room. But it will also be to do with the therapists themselves, as well as kind of larger. The larger social context, really. So how social issues may come into the work. So those words are, they both represent those three different things, but they're also in kind of come into each of those elements as well. So, for example, if we take, I mean, the word justice is obviously in the BACP ethical framework. It will be talked about by membership bodies. And so it's very much a word that I would associate with ethics. And very much is, doing, well, you could say doing justice for your clients, how you can really think about that in your client work. But then if we took a word like solidarity, well, that could have a double meaning. We could say solidarity with clients. So when we think about diversity, for example, how do we actually stay open to the fact that the people that are sitting in front of us are going to be, all kinds of people. And so how can we kind of have solidarity with not just their life experiences, but their cultural background, these kinds of things, which may, alter how we need to actually work with them. And that's very, very important in private practice, because at the end of the day, the buck stops with us. It's our business, and so we really need to be thinking about these things alongside with our supervisors, obviously. But then also we could take the word solidarity to mean how we support other private practitioners, how we are as a community of private practitioners. This is going to be really relevant in terms of like things like your group, Rory. How do students, for example, who are thinking of going into private practice, how can they support each other? How can they kind of, rather than going into this kind of competitive mode, which of course, sure, I'm here in Southwest London. I do need to be mindful of what makes me stand out as a therapist, in order to have my own business operating and doing well and things like that. But actually, the key there is that I am unique, and so the therapist down the road are going to have their own unique things that they offer, their own niches. So do we really always need to be in competition, or can we support each other? And how can that help? We're helping each other, but also how can that help the sector itself?
Yes, being a more collegial, a collegial body of therapists rather than a market economy where people are competing against each other. Yeah, I think it's a very, very good point. In terms of relational ethics, how do they impact on boundaries, do you think, that therapists set with clients?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's right in there, Rory, because boundaries would be the word that I would most associate with thinking about relational ethics and private practice. There's a whole chapter in this book on contracting, and that's very, very important. The contract is something that it's really important for private practitioners to kind of get right, actually, because of boundaries. Okay. And it's not so much, it is what you put in there. Obviously, we need to be thinking about how we can be ethical in the content of our contracts, but we also need to be thinking about how we run our own unique practices. And we need to feel confident with our own boundaries, okay? Because, and this is practice boundaries I'm talking about at the moment. So if I decide my cancellation policy, for example, we have a cancellation policy of, 48 hours, for example. But then if every time I have to enforce it, I feel a little bit like, I feel nervous. But they said they were unwell. Do I charge them? Do I not charge them? I might become a little bit flaky with boundaries. Okay. So sometimes I might just not charge a client. And then the next time comes around and I think, they were unwell last time, but they've been unwell. They're unwell again. And it's quite soon. It's quite close to that. So I'm going to charge them this time. But I'm not going to have any kind of conversation about why I might have done that differently. Now, that is an example of what could lead you to a complaint.
Yes.
And actually, we've got a little interview with Sue Dale, who's the head of ethics at BACP, and she was very much in agreement that it's kind of where the boundaries can slip is kind of what can get private practitioners in trouble, actually, when it comes to kind of, likelihoods of complaints, first of all, being made, and then secondly, being upheld. So I would say that boundaries really needs to be a word that's very, very much on your mind as a private practitioner. Now, that's not to say that we never flex our boundaries. If for therapeutic reasons, we may well be flexing our boundaries, but that requires careful consideration. It requires discussion and supervision, and also discussion with the client as well to kind of explain what's going on there. And of course, remember that when we are working for, say, an organisation, or if you're a student, you're in placement, you're going to have all the policies and the procedures laid out for you. So you've got a kind of a scaffolding behind you. But when you go into private practice, you don't have any of that. So you have to kind of come up with everything yourself. And that includes being mindful of your own therapeutic boundaries and what boundaries you're putting in your practice. So, very, very crucial.
Yeah, indeed. And I do think that it's something that we need to be aware of all the time. I like that you picked out the charging, not charging in one instance, and not enforcing the non-attendance policy in one instance, and then in the next instance charging for it. It's that inconsistency that can cause us so much difficulty, or cause people so much difficulty. One of the things that I liked in the book was the vignette of the therapist and his partner in the restaurant having an argument overheard by a client. Can you just say a little bit about that? Because I thought that was absolutely fascinating and a very real world application of how we apply ethics and relational ethics and boundaries.
So we use this vignette to kind of illustrate how the model that we've come up with could be applied. But of course, it's something that is very, very common in private practice. I live and I work in the same place. This kind of this is something I'm used to, but many private practitioners, and we need to consider all kinds of things in that. Now, Rory, you will understand this. We trained, you trained longer in the past than I did, but I trained quite a few years ago, and things used to be very I don't know, it felt like things were very strict. I mean, I kind of felt like we were wearing straitjackets. We have to be really very, very careful if we're living and working in the same area, and you'd almost be, I don't know, kind of frightened in case you ended up in the same places as your clients. And you've got to, not have, personal disclosure is something that is discussed a lot more now, which I think is a good thing, because it's something to be very, very mindful about. How do we do this? Why do we do this? How often can we do this? And I think social media has opened this conversation up a little more, because obviously in social media, we are disclosing aspects of ourselves if we have our profiles open to clients or whatever. And it can actually be a part of marketing as well. But this particular vignette, it was kind of saying what happens if you're just hanging out where you live and something goes on, and it's something that you might be embarrassed about. So like you said, an argument with a partner, and you might think, do I want my client to see this? Has the client seen? Do I bring it up with my client? Do I not bring it up with my client? And so there's, I'm glad you picked it out, because it's a good vignette, and there's many different things that we go through when we're reflecting on that. And of course, reflection is possibly one of my other favorite words, because, we just need to be doing this. This is the most important thing when it comes to ethics. Ethics is not about reading an ethics code or an ethical framework and getting the answer like it's black and white. It's not black and white. Okay, we have guidance within those codes and frameworks, but then we need to really reflect on what's gone on here for me. Who's the client? What have I got in my contract? Because that's an important thing here as well. Have you even said to your client, well, what happens if we bump into each other, for example? But yeah, reflection on so many different levels, and how we reflect both on our own, but also within the supervision space. And, you will hear me banging on about the importance of contracts and supervision. Okay. Now, that's not to demean the business element, the business side of things, because actually that is one of the things that makes private practice unique, in that we have the business part. But I find sometimes, particularly students who are coming out and going into private practice, they focus very much on the business part and on marketing and on getting those inquiries, which of course is important, but it's not everything. And if you want a sustainable practice, you need to really be thinking about contracting, how you do that, and also things like this, and how you're then going to reflect on ethical dilemmas that come up. And I think the other thing about, but where you might bump into your clients or whatever, is there's cultural things involved in that as well. For example, if you're a member of the LGBTQ plus community, well, you might be going to, I don't know, like a Pride festival or something like that. And so there might be more chance of you bumping into a client if that's your specialism, if you're specialising in working in that particular area. So yeah, really emphasising the importance of reflection. And I hope that vignettes like that and the model that we've offered in the book is really going to help people be able to do their own reflection, but to kind of have a model to use when they're doing that.
Yeah, I was just thinking about how therapy's evolved, and the training of therapy. Yes, certainly when I trained 20 odd years ago, there was still a kind of Freudian sniff around, if I may use that term, about non-self-disclosure, and I think we've become a little bit more introspective about that. I would like to think, and certainly the therapists I've spoken to don't seem to be as rigid about that. They will share appropriately, but I think that in there lies some work about what is appropriate and what isn't, and that could be in the room or indeed on social media. I remember a number of years ago when I used to enjoy cask ale. I went to a canal boat festival, and I may have worked my way along the bar, and I kind of staggered out, and as I staggered past my client, who thought it was hilarious when they met me on the Monday morning and said, "Well, you seem to have enjoyed the cask ale," and interestingly enough, that did develop a deeper relationship, because they saw me as a human and not as a therapist, but it did take some consideration. And I seem to remember I was a little bit angst-ridden about it when my head cleared the next day. I didn't say too much. I didn't say anything to the client, obviously, but it is interesting how it's developed. I guess my final question, you've talked very eloquently about the book and what it engages with and what it hopes to achieve. But if we look to the future, how would you like to see the field evolve in terms of ethical standards and relational accountability, specifically for those who work in private practice?
Yeah, good question. I think that there's been quite a lot of evolution anyway because of the pandemic. I actually think that and this is touched on in the book, there's certain things that maybe we wouldn't have thought about so much before. And, I love that story in terms of like being a human being. I think that the more people that are going into this field, particularly the change in demographic as well. So I would say that there was a time when mainly people going into the field were, perhaps it was their second or third career. And I know there was a Therapy Today article which said the largest number of people were women in their 50s, and that was quite a few years ago. Whereas now you get much younger people going in, and it's often their first qualification. So I think this would be something that I would be very interested in terms of, actually, if people are becoming therapists when they're younger, how can we make sure that our profession stays in the day and age of which we are, without diminishing the important work that we do. And ethics are super important. Every time I say ethics, someone said, I was talking to someone and we were talking about ethics, and they were like, oh, it's always a bit like dry, isn't it? And no one wants to talk about ethics. And it's like, well, I get it. I get it. Maybe it does sound dry, and maybe it is a bit like, but it's at the heart of our work. It really, really is. It's so in everything that we're doing as a therapist, going to be considering our ethical practice. And so for me, you said there about Freudian and non-disclosure, and I agree. And sometimes I feel like people are trying to drag us back or keep us in an age which just isn't appropriate. So in terms of when you say, the evolution of private practice, I don't know how it's going to be. I would like to see, maybe more variety in terms of how we think about private practice, people working together, thinking about things like group therapy and stuff like that as well. So there's more, I guess, more options for private practice, and more options in terms of things in the community. I actually think that because of the lack of NHS provision for therapy, and how private practice has just been overrun these past few years, I think we have something to offer. I think they could actually, private practitioners could be used in terms of, getting therapy out there and helping people that need it. And I guess I have a question about social media and other spaces like that, how when technology develops, what impact is that going to have on therapy? And that's interesting when it comes to ethics. Very interesting, because there's some real alarm bells that ring for me in terms of advances in technology and ethics. But then, there's space to consider where could these things be useful and how can we move with the times?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the whole movement of technology, artificial intelligence, social media probably is a whole different interview. So, yeah.
I'll see you in 5 years.
See me in 5 years' time. Relational Ethics in Psychotherapy and Counselling Private Practice, Solidarity, Compassion, Justice will be published on November the 26th, 2024 by Routledge. If you want details and links to where you can buy that book, if you go to counsellingtutor.com, look for podcast episode 318, click on that, and in the show notes page, we'll publish a lot of links, so you'll be able to see perhaps a little bit more about Caz's work, and also links to where you can buy the book, which just leaves me to say, Caz Binstead, thank you so much for joining us.
Massive thank you to Caz Binstead, and of course a big thank you to you, Rory, for reaching out and holding those all-important discussions that bring us our continuing professional development in the Practice Matters section. And as we kind of move away from Practice Matters, we're heading into Student Services. Student Services is sponsored by Counselling Skills Academy. Can't tell you how many times Rory and I have heard counselling students say that learning skills and knowing that they're using them effectively is really, really challenging. The reason for this is because we don't get to see another counsellor using skills in a real live session. In reality, this means that we're asked to learn something that we can never see demonstrated in a real setting. And it's no wonder that many of us are left feeling unsure. If you want to see counselling skills used in real sessions by qualified therapists, so this is real sessions, real presentations, and real use of skills, then go to counsellingskillsacademy.com. There's some free videos on skills, including a full live session that you can have a look at. Gain the competence and the confidence of knowing you're using your counselling skills effectively. Just visit counsellingskillsacademy.com. It's recognizing you on your journey to become a counselor, a psychotherapist. There are times of beauty, there are times of frustration during that journey. And of course, all of it linked into the growth of ourselves and as we develop the skills needed to serve our clients one day. And there's a requirement, certainly here in the United Kingdom, that you get to a point in your training and you go out and you do what's called placement counselling. And traditionally, it's not a paid-for role. It's you kind of being you're under the umbrella of a supervisor who's watching your practice as you take those early steps. You're still within your learning environment, and they're also holding you within that time. But it can take time, and there can be costs associated with that. You have to drive there. You might have to get somebody in to look after children or something while you're out. So we can carry expenses. And today's topic is about, can we claim any of the expenses that we kind of rack up from being a placement counsellor, Rory?
Well, the answer to that is yes. Some charitable organisations will pay you expenses. And there's actually an organisation called the NCVO, the National Council for Voluntary Organisations. And the headline says, NCVO champions the voluntary sector and volunteering. And part of that is discussing, what you can get. Because if you're a volunteer, by very definition, you're giving your time for free. And as such, there's a recognition that maybe, if possible, volunteers should get some expenses. And certainly when I trained, it was many years ago, I could claim my mileage to and from the practice. And if I was there for more than half a day, I could claim something to eat. So I would make sure my practice was half a day, and I got my chicken sandwich. And I can tell you, Ken, that when you're living on beans on toast, as I was for a long time, a nice chicken sandwich is a really nice thing, And also there were other things that you could claim, such as they had low cost CPD, and they at the time they contributed to supervision. So at the cost of supervision. So I think it's always useful if you, when you're going for your interview, ask, do they pay any form of expenses? Because that makes, I think a charity quite attractive to placement counsellors. Not all do, I have to say. And, times are tough for charities. I think that's fair to say. But it's well worth asking the question, and it can make such a difference. If you could claim your mileage to and from your practice, and maybe claim something to eat or some low-cost CPD, or they might have other benefits. It can actually go a long way to filling a bit of a gap in the finances, Ken.
Yeah, beautifully said. I don't know that I have much to add to that, Rory, other than the caveat here being, as you said, not all placements are going to offer this. So this is something that you need to ask about and check. So there's no law or standard procedure in place that you will get paid expenses, but it is well worth asking. They may be hearing it for the first time and go, what? Oh, I didn't know we needed to pay expenses, or that we could or should. And you can give them a link to the NCVO. It's ncvo.org.uk if you're based here in the United Kingdom, and we will put the link to this in the show notes for today's podcast, so you can get that and have that on hand, and you can have a look over it yourself as well, covering what you can claim for, which is travel, meals and refreshments if you are away from the place that you would normally eat. Care of dependents can be covered. administration costs. Do you have to phone or use any of your devices, stationery, anything like that? You might be able to ask and see how that works, but it does need to be negotiated with your placement. I don't know that I have much else to speak about on expenses, Rory. Do you have any more info you can share with us on that?
Well, I think one of the things is that, as a placement counsellor, you're a valuable person, because you're offering time for free, and you're more to the point. Usually counselling is part of a portfolio of offerings in mental health that an organisation may offer, and they will draw down funding from that. They'll draw it down from the government, or they'll draw it down from local authorities. And I think that as a placement counsellor, maybe it's ask the question. I think that if you're offering your time for free, then you're entitled to say, are there any expenses, and try and push that forward as an agenda item. You may get pushback, and you may say, well, we haven't got any money for a charity, we haven't got any money. But it may be that it's, if the voice is loud enough, pots of money can be found. My experience of working for charities is that sometimes when they come to the funding, if there's a strong enough voice for a separate set of funding for something within the charity. So in our case, it was supervision. What happened was that when they were negotiating with the local authority, a pot of money was found to support part payment of supervision. So I always think it's useful that if you are a placement therapist, have a voice, ask the question, because you're very valuable. I think people forget that counselling is a part of an offer that a lot of charities put into their offer when they're bidding for pots of money. And as such, I think that placement counsellors should, in an ideal world, to be paid, but we don't live in an ideal world. But I think if your voice is strong enough, you never know what might happen.
Wow. There it is for you. And if you want the link to the NCVO and the article that Rory and I have discussed today, counsellingtutor.com, find your way to the podcast tab, find episode 318, that's 318. It's right there in the show notes. We're so grateful that you joined us today. This has been episode 318 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. The National Counselling and Psychotherapy Society, or NCPS, proudly sponsor this podcast, supporting students every step of the way. Join the NCPS for resources, training, and a friendly, knowledgeable community to enhance your learning experience. Visit ncps.com.
Yeah, as we started off with ethical, sustainable practice, autism in the law, and we talked about finding out the things you don't know about and abiding by the law, and also making your practice attractive to a cohort of clients who historically maybe have been disadvantaged by both the lack of knowledge and the lack of adjustments made for them when going to counselling. In Practice Matters, we interviewed Caz Binstead about a wonderful book talking about relational ethics in psychotherapy and counselling private practice, and there's possibly she's going to do a lecture for the Counselling Tutor CPD library on that. And then finally we moved to claiming expenses as a placement counsellor in student services. And finally, we'd like to thank everybody who's left us wonderful reviews on iTunes or any of the social media platforms regarding the podcast. So Ken and myself, thank you. And as always, stay grounded and stay safe.
Take the stress out of your counselling studies and get the support of Rory and I by joining us in the Counselling Study Resource. Counselling Study Resource, or CSR for short, is the world's most comprehensive assignment guidance and study support resource for students just like you of counselling and psychotherapy. See how Counselling Study Resource can help you. Visit counsellingtutor.com. That's counsellingtutor.com.
Thank you for listening to the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Find the show notes for this episode by visiting counsellingtutor.com.